Okay, hi everybody. Here's a map of the kingdom or empire of Persia. As you can see, it covers a lot of ground. Last week we talked about Daniel, and he was a captive from when the Babylonians came and took over Judah. Now you can see Jerusalem here. Judah was just a very small place, just a little tiny place there, and Israel was north of there. You can see the name of it, but Babylon and then the Medes and the Persians, they were large. They were huge. They covered a vast expanse. And remember, the people of Judah and Israel had been taken way over here. Here's Babylon here. And then the Persian kingdom had its capital in Shushan over here. So today we are going to be talking about another captive in the land of Persia, and she lived in Shushan, where the king lived. Okay. And this book is the book of Esther, and it's all about the protection of God for his people, the Jewish people, in a hostile land. And you may think, well, how was it hostile? Well, they were taken as captives and they were brought into an area where it was native for the Persians to be living, not native for the Israelites. So they were like strangers there. They weren't really welcome. They were considered to be lower class. They had been conquered, and they weren't always really welcome. You see, they were in enemy territory, and they had lived in Israel where it was safe to practice the law of God and worship him in their whole lives. They had peace. They could do what they liked to worship God and honor him. It was a blessing of God to give them that land so they could do that. Now they were in another land where they worshiped other gods, and they didn't want these people here really. And so as long as the Jews did not publicly show their faith, as long as they didn't really worship God for others to see, they could live a life of peace. They had to live like their neighbors and kind of hide their faith and obey God in secret if they wanted to be safe and not have to deal with the hatred of the people around them. And some of the Jews, remember, they were idol worshippers, so they would have fit right in. It didn't matter to them. They'd eat whatever food sacrificed to idols. They would sacrifice themselves. They just fit right in with those other people. But for some, it was more difficult. Okay, so in the book of Esther, the king at the time was King Ahasuerus, also known as King Xerxes. And at the beginning of the book, of the record of what had happened, this king, he gave a huge party. He gave a big party for 180 days. There's 365 days a year, so you can see how long this party lasted. It was an extremely long party, and it was for all the princes and nobles in that huge country that we talked about. So people would have come, his princes and nobles from all over this area would have come to Persia for his big party. Well, then they all went home, and he gave a smaller party, a feast for the people, the men, who lived in the Shushan area, palace area. And that lasted for 7 days, and he served a lot of wine, so after all that time, they were getting kind of drunk. Well, his queen, the king's wife, was Vashti. She was very beautiful. And she also gave a party for the ladies. In their culture, the men and the women, they kept separate. They weren't together. And she only gave her party for 1 day, a feast for 1 day for the ladies in the palace area. And in the middle of the last day, the king, Ahasuerus, he was a little bit not all there. And he thought, oh, my wife is so beautiful, guys. You have just got to see. Oh, servant, go get Vashti. Tell her she needs to come here. I want all these men to see how beautiful my wife is. And so the servant went to get Vashti, the queen. She was the hostess at this other party for the ladies. And when the servant told her what the king wanted, she said no. She wouldn't go. She didn't want to go parade herself in front of a party of men that were sloshed. And so the servant went back to the king and told him. Well, the king was mortified. You see, in that culture especially, a wife was supposed to obey her husband all the time, in all things. And his wife, the queen, had just refused to obey him, the king, the ruler of that entire huge empire, in front of all of his men that were under him. So she had really humiliated him in front of all these people. He was so embarrassed. And so he met later with his advisors and he said, this was so embarrassing. This was horrible. What should we do about this? What do I need to do about this? And his advisor said, if you don't get rid of Vashti, all the other women in the kingdom, they're going to hear about that. And if the queen can refuse the king, then all the other men's husbands are going to be like, I don't want to do what you tell me to do. And that would just be terrible for our whole country. So you need to get rid of Vashti. She can't be the queen anymore. So the king listened and he got rid of Vashti. She was gone. She wasn't allowed to be the queen anymore. Well, after a while, King Ahasuerus got lonely. He missed Vashti. He had made a bad judgment call there, like a bad error. And so he asked his advisors, what should I do now? And they said, well, you should have a contest, a kind of beauty contest. We can go in the whole empire and find all the beautiful girls in the entire empire and bring them to the palace. And for a year, they can beautify themselves. And then you can look at them at the end of the year and pick whichever one you want. And the king Ahasuerus thought, that's a really good idea. Let's go ahead and do that. Meanwhile, there was a girl who was very beautiful. She was a Jew living in Shushan with her cousin, Mordecai. He was like a father to her because her parents were dead. And so it was just the two of them. They only had each other. And Mordecai taught her everything that she needed, gave her everything she needed. And when the servants of the king came around looking for beautiful girls, they found Esther. And they took her to the palace. But before she went, Mordecai gave her some advice. He said, don't tell anyone you're a Jew. If you want things to go well for you, just keep that a secret. So off she went to the palace, and she was taken with all the other girls. But God blessed Esther, just like he had blessed Daniel. And just like Daniel found favor in the eyes of the man who was in charge of him and all the other young men in Babylon, Esther found favor and became the favorite of the man who was in charge of taking care of all the young ladies that came to the palace to beautify themselves for the beauty contest. So what did that entail? Well, the man in charge gave Esther 7 maids to help her be beautiful, I guess. And for 6 months, she and the other girls were to use like oil of myrrh on their skin to get nice skin. And then for 6 more months, they were going to use perfumes so that they would smell pretty. And at the end of the year, she would go in with the other girls one at a time. They would go before the king, and he, at the end of it, would pick which one he liked the best, and that one would become the queen. So when the time came, they were all allowed to pick one thing to take with them to go see the king, and Esther was not a greedy, grasping person at all, as you might expect. She was beautiful on the inside as well as the outside. She was just mild and gentle, and she didn't ask anything. And that really gave her extra favor with the people around her. And when she went in to see the king, it didn't matter that she hadn't asked for anything because he chose her. She was his favorite too. And he crowned her the queen and gave a big celebration, a feast, and sent proclamations through the land that he had found his new queen. He was so happy. Well, Mordecai, through all of this, would go and walk by the palace where Esther was every day to see how she was doing through that whole year. And he would sit in the king's gate, the Bible says. Now, he may have just been sitting by the king's gate to keep an eye on things and see what was going on. But in other places in the Bible, it refers to people who sit in the king's gate as being important people. Often they had places of authority. So I'm not really sure if he was just sitting there or if he did have some kind of status with the king, but that's where he was. Here's Esther crowned as queen. Well, one day when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, he overheard two of the chamberlains, the king's guards, and they were talking to each other. And they didn't notice him, I guess, and they were mad at the king for some reason, and they were discussing this, and they were getting madder and madder, and they started to plot how they would destroy the king. And Mordecai just sat there quietly and listened to the whole thing. And then he sent a message to the king about this plot, and the two chamberlains were arrested, and they were tried and condemned because of what Mordecai had overheard. Now, you'll need to remember this for later in the story. It seems like kind of a random bit of information, but it's very important. Okay, right about this time, the king promoted one of his princes. The man's name was Haman. And he promoted him above all the other princes. He became the most important one. And Haman was full of himself. He just thought he was awesome. And he thought that he deserved everything the king would give him because he was just so great. And one of the commandments of the king was that when he walked through the gate, that all the people in the gate would bow to Haman to show their respect because he was so important now. So every day he would walk through the gate and Mordecai would be there and the others would bow down and Mordecai wouldn't, remember? God had told the Jews not to worship or bow to anything except him. God was the only one worthy of their worship. And so he refused to bow to Haman. At first Haman didn't notice, but let me tell you, the other men, the Persians, they noticed. And just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at the fiery furnace, the people around them, they noticed and they wanted to tell the king, make sure they got their punishment since they had to bow. They wanted him to bow too, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so first they talked to Mordecai, well, why don't you bow? And Mordecai said, well, it's because I'm a Jew and I worship only God. And so then when Haman came in, somebody spoke up to him. And they said, oh, Haman, did you notice Mordecai over there? He doesn't bow down because he's a Jew. Is that okay? Well, obviously they're not just checking to see if that's okay. They really want to get him in trouble. You all know that. Well, Haman was furious. Someone who wouldn't respect him. He was so angry. So Haman had heard from the other men the reason that Mordecai didn't want to bow down was because he was a Jew. So Haman got a plan and he went to the king and he said, oh, king, I just need to let you know, there's a whole bunch of people in your kingdom that they just want to do their own thing. They don't listen to you. They don't follow your commands. They think that they don't need to listen to your commands because they're not really Persians. They're a different nationality. They're just captives. And I think it would be better for our whole empire if you just got rid of them. They won't listen to you anyway, so what good are they? In fact, I have some money. Let's see, 10,000 talents of silver that I have, and I'll just give that to you to help you in getting rid of these people. And the king He didn't know anything about it. He said, oh, sure. Here's my ring. Remember the ring that would seal the wax or whatever was used at the bottom of a law to show that the king had made it and it was authentic? Here's my ring. You go make a law. So Haman did make a law. He made a law that on the 13th day of Adar, that was a month in the Jewish calendar, probably the Persian calendar, that all the people in Persia were allowed to kill their Jewish neighbors and take everything they owned. Well, the Jews were blessed by God everywhere they went, and many of them were quite wealthy. And the people that lived around them were jealous of them. And so this really made them happy. The Persians thought, this is great. That guy down there, he has better clothes than me. And he's just somebody we took captive from another country. I'm totally going down there on the 13th day of Adar and taking whatever I want. And so this law was made, sealed. Remember, the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed. It was sent by horseback to every corner of the empire so that everybody knew what was going to happen and they could get ready for it. Well, the Jews read it and they were terrified. Of course, on the 13th day of Adar, everyone around them was going to try and kill them and take their stuff. They did what they always did when they were upset. They ripped their clothes. They put on sackcloth, that dry, itchy cloth, and they put ashes on their head to show how sad they were, how humble they were, and they cried loudly. Mordecai did this. He walked up and down the streets of Shushan, crying loudly, lamenting, praying to God with ashes on his head and sackcloth on him. Well, Esther's maids knew that she had a special interest in Mordecai. They knew who he was and they saw him and they told Esther what was going on. And his clothes are all ripped, he's wearing sackcloth, he's crying a lot. Esther had not heard the news. And so she just got a servant and got some really nice, expensive clothes and asked the servant to take Mordecai some new clothes. But Mordecai got them and he was like, no. You need to tell Esther this. And he gave the servant a copy of the law that Haman had written to send back to her. And he said, tell her that she's the one in the palace. She needs to go before the king and see if she can help in this matter. So the servant took this all to Esther and Esther read it. And she was so upset. And she wrote back. She gave a message back to Mordecai. She said, but don't you understand? I may be the queen, but I can't just go talk to the king whenever I want to. The king has to call me. And he hasn't called me. For 30 days he hasn't called me. And not only that, but if I take it upon myself to go see the king, and he doesn't want to see me, if he doesn't lower his scepter, his long golden scepter, they're going to take me out and kill me. So I can't just go waltz in there and demand to see the king. And Mordecai sent her back a very important message. He said, let me find my spot here. He said, I think I need to look it in the Bible. I'm going to find it. Give me a second. He said, Esther, do you think that you will escape when all the other Jews are killed just because you're in the palace? Do not think that you will escape. You will not. If you hold your peace at this time, if you don't go talk to the king about this now, then God will send deliverance from somebody else. If it's not you, someone else will come and deliver the Jews. And you will be punished because you didn't do what you could. You have the opportunity to help. And if you don't help, you will be punished for not doing what you could. And who knows? but that you were actually chosen and put into the palace for this purpose. Maybe you weren't chosen because you were the prettiest. Maybe you weren't chosen because you were the nicest. Maybe you were chosen because God knew this was going to happen. And so he wanted you in there to save your people. So Esther wrote him back. And she said, okay, I'll do it. But you have to gather all the Jews in Shushan together, and you need to fast. You know what fasting is? It's not eating. In this case, not eating or drinking day or night for 3 days. She said, no, nothing, no food, no water, nothing for 3 days and nights. And I also and my maids will fast for 3 days and nights, and then I will go and see the king. I'm sure they were praying as they were fasting. So Esther and her 7 maids all fasted and prayed about the situation. And then after the 3 days, sorry, did I say 7? After 3 days, Esther put on her royal robes. She got her hair done. She was looking as good as she could. And she went to see the king. She went to his royal room and she stood in the doorway and waited. I'm sure her heart was beating. Is he going to accept me or not? And the king looked up and saw her there. And he lowered the scepter. He was like, I am so glad to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. He had kind of forgotten all about her, I guess. And he was so excited that Esther had come to see him. He said, what is it that you've come to me about? What do you want? I'll give you anything you want, up to half the kingdom. He was quite superfluous, quite generous. And she said, well, I do have a request. I would like you and Haman to come to a banquet I've made for you. The king was like, great, send a messenger, get Haman. So off they went to Esther's banquet. It was a lovely banquet. They enjoyed themselves very much. And then when the king had dined and he was feeling full and happy, he said, okay, now Esther, what is it you would like? He knew that there was more than just a banquet going on. He said, I'll give you whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. She said, well, yes, there is something I'd like. How about you come to a banquet tomorrow? Just you and Haman again. And they said, sure, good, that's great. Now, whether she did this on purpose to keep the suspense building, or whether it wasn't the right timing, or whether she lost her nerve, I'm not sure. I heard it was a cultural thing sometimes to do that sort of thing. Anyways, off to a banquet the next day. Well, Haman left. He was so proud of himself. Look at me. I went to a private banquet with the queen and the king alone, just me. Oh, it was wonderful. You should have seen me. He went home, but on his way home, he saw Mordecai in the gate, and Mordecai didn't bow. So that was the fly in the ointment. Mordecai was his nemesis, the thing he hated in all the world. So he went home, he called all his wife and all his friends together, and he started bragging. He bragged about his 10 big strong sons. He bragged about his place in court. He bragged about being promoted. He bragged about his riches. He bragged about everything he could think of and told them all about the banquet he had gone to, and everyone was like, ooh, you're awesome, Haman. And then he said, but there's one thing I don't like. It's that Mordecai. He's just driving me crazy. The 13th of Adar can't come soon enough. I just want to get rid of him. And so his friend said, well, why don't you build a gallows 80 feet high? That is so tall. 10 ceilings high. Why don't you go build a gallows 80 feet high? And if you're so close to the king, just ask him tomorrow morning if you can hang Mordecai. What will he care? Well, Haman thought this is a brilliant plan, and he ordered the gallows built right away that very night, ready for Mordecai the next morning. But God knew everything that was going on, and that night the king could not sleep. He tossed and turned and just couldn't sleep, so he called one of his men to come and read the records of the kingdom before him. So just like the Babylonians, the Persians would keep a record of everything that happened in the kingdom, like the newspaper, only it was the stuff that happened in the kingdom that related to the king. And he was reading in the night, and then he heard the story of how Mordecai had saved the king's life. And he said, oh, wait, stop. Did we ever do anything for Mordecai? Because that was awfully nice of him to save my life. And the servant said, nope, nothing was ever done for Mordecai. And the king thought, ooh, something should be done. And he heard somebody out, and he said, oh, who's that? Who's come this morning? And they said, oh, that's Haman. He came early. Call Haman in. I want to talk to him. So Haman comes in. Remember, he's thinking he wanted to request the death of Mordecai. The king's thinking he wanted to reward Mordecai. Funny, he's on everyone's thoughts. So the king spoke first, and he said, Haman, I need your advice. What should be done for the man that the king delights to honor? Now Haman, full of himself, as usual, thought, ah ha ha ha, who would the king delight to honor more than me? I am the most important man in the kingdom. This is totally me. What would I like? Ooh, I know. I want to wear the royal crown and wear a royal robe, and I want to ride on the king's royal horse, and I want the highest prince in the land to walk in front of me leading the horse, calling out like a parade in all the streets of Shushan. This is what will happen to the man that the king delights to honor. Yeah, that's a good idea. So he said, this should be done. The crown, the robes, the horse, the prince. The king said, that's a brilliant idea. Now I want you, as my royal prince, to go find Mordecai, who sits in the gate, and do it to him. And Haman knew right away his doom was sealed. How could this be happening? This was more than a coincidence. He went and did what the king said. The crown, the robes, the horse, himself. This is what will happen to the man that the king delights to honor, all through the town, for everyone to see, even Haman's friends that knew how much he hated Mordecai. And then after that happened, he had time to run home and lament to his wife and friends. Oh no, do you know what happened to me today when I went to ask? You would not believe it. This is what happened. And his friends were like, you are in trouble now. This is not a coincidence. You are going down, Mordecai. You better watch out. Are you up to date on your last will and testament? Well, let me find my spot. Okay, so Haman went to the banquet. He was told to come. He was actually late. The king had to send messengers to go get him from his house and bring him to the banquet. Off he went to the banquet. What he thought was going to be just the crowning moment of his day turned into, oh no, what's going to happen? There he went to the banquet, and at the end of their lovely meal, the king said to Esther, what would you like, dear? Up to half the kingdom. And Esther said, I would like you to save my life. Me and my people, we have been sold to be killed. If we were just sold as captives to be slaves, I wouldn't bother you with this. But we have been sold to be killed. Will you please help us? And the king said, who would presume to do such a thing to my wife, the queen? And she turned and she said, this wicked Haman here sitting right at the table with us. The king was so upset. His most prized prince, he was the one. He had to get out of his chair and he had to go walking. He went out the doors of the room they were in into the garden, and he was pacing around the garden thinking about all this, all upset. And while he was gone, Haman knew bad things were in store for him. So he jumped out of his chair and he ran over to Esther, and she was lounging on one of these long seat things, and he fell on her feet and he was like, please, please have mercy on me. And as he was in the midst of this, the king walked back in the room and saw him leaning over the queen and said, will he try and hurt the queen right in my own house in front of my face? And as he said it, the servants were not slack. They were not slow. They came and they put a cover over Haman's face to show that he was in trouble. He was done. And obviously, he did not have a lot of love among the servants at the palace. Well, then one of the chamberlains, the king's guard, spoke up and said, oh, by the way, king, if you're wondering what to do with Haman, he just built an 80-foot tall gallows to hang Mordecai on. You know the man that you just honored this morning? He wanted to hang him on there. Just so you know, it's available. And so the king hung Haman for his despicable behavior on the gallows that he had planned to hang Mordecai on. Well, the story isn't quite done because the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed. And that day and Adair, it was still coming faster and faster. What were they going to do about all the Jews that were liable to be killed? Well, let me find my notes here so I don't get it wrong. Okay. The king made Esther the owner of everything that Haman had owned. Then the king, he got to know Mordecai as being Esther's relative. He realized, she told him that Mordecai was her cousin and like a father to her. And so he was promoted. He was given royal robes. He was given the king's ring. That used to be on Haman's finger. He was given a big golden crown, the Bible says. And then Esther came before the king again, and she begged and begged that he do something to save her people. And the king said, yes, sure. He gave his sealing ring to Mordecai this time. And Mordecai made a law that the Jews were allowed to protect themselves. They were allowed to defend themselves against anyone that tried to kill them and take their stuff. And so the law was made. It was sent to all the parts of the land where the first law had gone. And on the 13th of Adar, the people, the Jews, protected themselves, and they were not killed as Haman had originally planned. Not only that, but when people heard this whole story in Persia, that huge, huge land of Persia, many of the Persians became Jews because they recognized that this was different. This was not idols that couldn't do anything. This was a God that actually had power and could control things. And so because of the fear of the Jewish God, these Persians became Jews. And Mordecai became greater and greater. He became the highest prince in the land instead of Haman. And the 14th day of Adar, I think I said 13th earlier, sorry. The 14th day of Adar became a day of feasting. Mordecai sent word to all the Jews in Persia saying, from now and forever, the 14th and 15th were to be remembered with feasting like a holiday and reading the story of Esther and remembering how they had been saved. And these are called the days of Purim. And that is the entire book of Esther. I know it took a while. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a lovely story of how God works and how his children were brave in the face of death. And God blessed them and used them to bless an entire empire. People came to know him through it all, and the Jews were saved. So, thanks, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, bye.